At a quiet diner, Margaret Ellis's only son tells her Christmas will be spent just for her side of the family. One sentence shatters decades of tradition, leaving Margaret alone with stockings no one will touch, a phone that never rings, and a love that refuses to die. But in the silence of rejection, she discovers a legacy that cannot be erased. Would you have the strength to keep the candle burning when even family turns away? The diner had always been the same red vinyl booths, softened by decades of use, the faint hiss of a grill from behind the counter, a waitress with a pencil tucked into her messy bun, moving from table to table. It was the kind of place where the coffee never tasted remarkable, but the warmth of the cup between your hands felt steady, reliable. Margaret Ellis had chosen it for that very reason. She told herself it was neutral ground, a place where nothing dramatic could possibly happen. After all, who could break a heart under fluorescent lights and the smell of frying bacon? She sat across from her son, watching the steam curl from his mug. Evan had always been handsome in a boyish way, though at 39 he now wore the weariness of a man stretched too thin. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms. He looked like a man who'd meant to make time and almost hadn't. She noticed the way he checked his watch, when he thought she wasn't looking, the flick of his eyes toward the phone resting screen down beside his plate. Still, she smiled. This was her boy, the one she had raised on little more than determination and casseroles stretched 3 nights too long. She asked about work, about the grandchildren, about Claire's new position at the hospital. Evan answered dutifully, though distracted, as though his thoughts were already halfway out the door. She stirred sugar into her coffee and let him talk, cataloguing every detail in her mind. These lunches were rare now, each one precious in a way she doubted he understood. Their food came his club sandwich stacked too tall to bite gracefully, her bowl of tomato soup with crackers on the side. For a while they ate in companionable quiet, the clink of cutlery and the low murmur of other conversations filling the space. Margaret felt the warmth of it, the small illusion of family, and held on to it as tightly as she could. But she noticed the way Evan's jaw tightened after the first few bites, the way he avoided her eyes. She knew him too well. Something sat heavy on his tongue, waiting. She braced herself without knowing why, as though an instinct deeper than thought had sounded the alarm. It came suddenly, slipped between a swallow of water and a napkin dabbed to his lips. "Mum," he said, his tone carefully casual, "we're keeping Christmas just for her side of the family this year." The words landed like a door closing, quietly but decisively. Margaret blinked, her spoon hovering above her soup, the steam rising around it. She looked at him, but he was already shifting in his seat, already reaching for another bite of sandwich, as though he had simply remarked on the weather. She could have asked him to repeat it. She could have demanded an explanation. Instead, she lowered her eyes to the cup in front of her, lifted it slowly, and took a sip. The coffee was lukewarm now, bitter at the back of her tongue, but it gave her something to do with her hands, something to keep her face steady. She swallowed, careful, precise. Inside, though, her chest caved. Christmas, for years it had been hers to shape, even after Michael died, even when money was scarce. She had baked the cookies, strung the lights, wrapped gifts in paper scavenged from sales bins. She had carried the season like a lantern for Evan, determined that he would never feel the hollowness she had known as a child. Now, in one easy sentence, he had set her outside of it. She nodded faintly, forcing her lips into something close to a smile. "That sounds nice," she managed. Her voice was thin, barely above the hum of the diner. Evan didn't notice, or maybe he chose not to. He launched into talk about Claire's family traditions, the big dinner, the stockings by the fire, the chaos of too many cousins in one house. His face lit in a way that once had been reserved for hers. Margaret listened, nodding in the right places, sipping her coffee again and again, until it was gone. The waitress came by, pot in hand. "Refill?" she asked brightly. Margaret lifted her cup automatically, nodding. The dark liquid poured in, rippling to the brim, and she wrapped both hands around it, as though it might keep her from unraveling. Across from her, her son smiled, caught up in the world he was building without her. She smiled back, though the weight of the words sat heavy in her chest. "We're keeping Christmas just for her side of the family." She thought of the boxes of ornaments in her attic, of the angel that had topped their tree for decades. She thought of stockings folded neatly in a drawer, waiting. She thought of the empty space that Christmas morning would bring, and how she would have to learn to fill it with something other than silence. But in that moment, in that booth, under buzzing lights, she said nothing. She just took another sip. The sound of the diner went on as if nothing had happened, the scrape of forks, the low hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. But for Margaret Ellis, the entire world had tilted. She heard the words, again, replayed them in her mind, slower this time, sharper. "We're keeping Christmas just for her side of the family this year." They echoed in her chest, like the dull chime of a clock marking an hour she hadn't been ready to face. Evan didn't look at her when he said it. That hurt more than the words themselves. His eyes darted toward the window, toward the parking lot where snow dusted the hoods of cars, as though he couldn't bear to watch the weight of his sentence land. He picked up his sandwich, took a bite too big, and chewed with the intensity of a man avoiding silence. Margaret sat perfectly still. 67 years had taught her how to hold her body steady when her heart was breaking. She had learned it the day Michael walked out the door with his duffel bag and a promise he never kept. She had learned it in hospital waiting rooms when doctors spoke in low tones about her father's fading lungs. She had learned it on the nights she stayed awake while Evan coughed through fevers, whispering strength into his small shoulders. Life had shown her again and again that sometimes survival meant keeping your hands folded and your face calm while inside. Everything cracked. Her spoon hovered above the soup, but she didn't taste another bite. She stared at the ripples cooling in the bowl, at her reflection, warped by broth, and wondered how a sentence so simple could slice her so deep. Christmas had always been her season, her one unwavering tradition. It was more than a holiday, it was proof that even when life stripped you bare, you could still gather light and laughter around a table. To be told she had no place in it this year felt like being erased. She wanted to ask him why. She wanted to remind him of all the mornings he had come thundering down the stairs in his pajamas, eyes wide at the sight of gifts piled under the tree she had stayed up until 2 a.m. wrapping. She wanted to ask if he remembered the smell of cinnamon rolls in the oven, or the carols they sang while she played piano with clumsy fingers. She wanted to ask if those memories meant nothing now that he had a wife and children of his own. But she said none of it. She took another sip of coffee instead, letting the bitter warmth coat her tongue. It was easier to drink than to speak. Evan swallowed the last of his sandwich and reached for his phone, glancing at the screen before tucking it back under his hand. "Claire's folks are really excited," he said, almost cheerfully. "They do this huge thing, 30 people, maybe more. It'll be fun for the kids. They'll have cousins to play with, you know." He looked at her then, finally, and smiled like he was offering her consolation. Margaret forced her lips into a shape that matched his, though it felt brittle, like porcelain about to crack. "That sounds wonderful," she murmured, though the words scraped her throat on the way out. The waitress appeared again, topping off his water, offering pie. Evan declined, checking his watch. "I've got to head back soon," he said. "Big project at work." He said it lightly, like leaving her sitting alone in the booth was nothing more than the natural order of things. Margaret nodded, folding her napkin with careful precision. "Of course, you're busy." She had always said that line, always given him the out, the gentle excuse that smoothed his guilt. He leaned over, kissed her cheek quickly, and slid out of the booth. "We'll do something in January, Mum. Maybe New Year's I'll call." And then he was gone. The bell over the diner door jingled. Cold air rushed in, and just like that, her only son had walked out into a December afternoon that no longer belonged to her. Margaret sat still for a long time, the untouched soup cooling in front of her, the coffee refilled but growing bitter again. Around her, laughter rose from another table where a family gathered, 3 generations packed into one booth. She turned her head away, her chest tightening. She picked up her pen from her purse, flipped open the back of a receipt, and wrote, one line in shaky script, "I have been uninvited from Christmas." She slid it into her journal later that night. But in that diner, she simply folded the paper once, pressed it flat with her palm, and whispered to herself the only truth she could manage. "Something has shifted, and I don't know how to shift with it." The coffee had cooled to the point of being almost unpleasant, but Margaret lifted the mug again, drawing it to her lips as though it were a shield. The rim pressed lightly against her mouth, and she let the bitter liquid roll over her tongue, swallowed slowly, deliberately, each sip a way to buy time. Her son's words were still suspended in the air between them, though he had moved on, chattering about Claire's extended family with a kind of bright eagerness that stung more than silence would have. She held the mug with both hands, anchoring herself in its weight. Her palms grew damp against the ceramic, and she told herself, "Just sip, Margaret, just sip and don't let it show." The diner carried on around them, clinking cutlery, bursts of laughter, the hiss of bacon on the grill, but it all sounded distant, muffled by the roar of blood in her ears. Evan spoke quickly, as though filling the silence would erase the sharpness of what he'd said. "They've got this huge tree," he was saying. "Real pine, ceiling to floor. Claire's dad cuts it down himself every year, and they do this game with the kids, some kind of scavenger hunt for candy canes. It's chaos, but fun. The kids will love it." Margaret nodded faintly, her eyes fixed on the dark surface of her coffee. She saw her reflection rippling there, distorted by the steam that had long since faded. Once, he had loved her tree. Once, he had pulled candy canes from the branches she decorated by hand, red bows she tied one by one when her fingers were young enough not to ache. The thought pressed hard in her throat, but she swallowed it down with another sip. The bitterness of the drink seemed to match the bitterness curling inside her. She let the taste sit on her tongue longer than usual, as if by holding onto it she could distract herself from the other flavor rising grief. She thought of Christmas mornings when Evan was small, padding down the stairs in pajamas with cartoon reindeer, hair sticking up in every direction, face lit with joy at the sight of stockings overflowing. She thought of how she had stayed up through the night, stringing popcorn, wrapping toys, making sure the magic never broke for him. Michael had been gone by then, but Margaret never let the absence shadow the holiday. She carried it alone, year after year, so that Evan would always have a place where Christmas lived bright. And now he was telling her she had no place in it at all. She didn't correct him. She didn't ask him how he could erase her so casually. She didn't remind him that her love for the holiday was born from sacrifice, from the way she bent her own loneliness into something glittering just for him. Instead, she took another sip. Her silence went unnoticed. Evan continued, checking his watch between bites. He spoke of Claire's cousins, of the long drive to her parents' house, of how it would be easier this way. That word again, as though including his mother were a complication rather than a comfort. Margaret placed her cup back on the saucer with careful precision. The tiny clink echoed louder than she meant it to, but Evan didn't flinch. He was already looking toward the door, already gathering his things. She smiled, small and practiced, and said only, "That sounds nice." Later, when he slid from the booth and kissed her cheek, she let him go without protest. The bell over the diner door jingled behind him, letting in a draft of cold December air. Margaret stayed seated, wrapping her hands around the mug once more. The coffee was nearly gone, the last sip tepid and harsh. She drank it anyway, pressing her lips firmly to the rim, as though the act itself could hold her together. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She simply sipped until the cup was empty, staring at the ring of dark residue at the bottom that struck her then. This was what her place in her son's life had become. Not the warmth of the first pour, not the comfort of shared laughter over a fresh pot, but the dregs left behind, bitter, unwanted, swallowed only to keep from spilling. Margaret set the cup down, folded her hands neatly in her lap, and whispered into the quiet booth, "So this is how it ends." And then she lifted her chin, straightened her shoulders, and walked out into the cold, the taste of that final sip still sharp against her tongue. The drive home blurred past in streaks of grey and white. Snow flurried lightly across the windshield, gathering in the corners where the wipers missed, and Margaret Ellis kept her hands firmly on the steering wheel. She wasn't truly watching the road at least not in the way she usually did, with the small attentiveness of a woman who had spent decades driving cautiously through New England winters. Her mind was elsewhere, unraveling in pieces, pulling her back into years when December had meant something entirely different. Christmas had always been hers to carry. She had inherited almost nothing from her own childhood traditions. Her parents had been practical to a fault, people who considered holidays a nuisance, a disruption to the normal schedule of work and chores. She remembered being a little girl, staring out frosted windows at neighbors' houses glowing with colored lights, wondering why her own living room stayed dark and bare. She had promised herself, even then, that if she ever had children, they would never feel the emptiness she had, and so she built it from scratch. When Michael was still around, she had tried to make the holidays a shared effort, buying a tree too big for their small living room, coaxing him to hang ornaments while Evan giggled on the floor, more interested in pulling tissue paper from boxes than anything else. Michael participated at first, grumbling good-naturedly, until the year he didn't, until the year he came home late, shrugged at the half-decorated tree, and said he didn't see the point. That had been one of the final Christmases before he left. After that, it was only her. She strung the lights alone, her fingers freezing on the porch ladder as she looped bulbs across the railing. She baked cookies in an oven that often sputtered, packed lunches by day, and wrapped gifts by night. She worked double shifts at the library, saving scraps of money just to make sure Evan would wake up to something magical. Even when her bones ached, even when she wanted nothing more than sleep, she stayed awake to stuff stockings and hide surprises. The memory made her throat tighten now. She could see it as if it were yesterday. Evan, at 6 years old, bounding into her bedroom before dawn, tugging her hand with wide eyes. "Come see, Mom. Santa came. He really came." His small fingers had been sticky with excitement, his hair standing up in every direction. She had stumbled behind him, half asleep, only to feel her heart crack open when she saw the wonder on his face. That moment alone had been worth every sacrifice, and she had kept at it, year after year. Through the lean years when gifts were fewer and she made up the difference with board games borrowed from the library. Through the teenage years when Evan rolled his eyes but still secretly drank the cocoa she left warming on the stove. Through college, when he came home bleary-eyed from exams and she insisted on decorating together, even if it was just one string of lights. Christmas had been her thread of consistency, proof that no matter how hard the world pressed against them, she could still create something soft and shining. Now, driving home from that diner, she realized just how fragile that thread had become. Her son had spoken with such casual certainty, as though those years of effort were simply stepping stones toward this new life of his, where she no longer belonged. His children, her grandchildren, would run beneath a tree she would never see, laugh in a house where her chair sat empty. The thought sliced at her ribs. Margaret pulled into her driveway, the tires crunching against snow. The house looked the same as always, yellow siding, shutters slightly crooked, the wreaths she had hung out of habit, though she hadn't yet bothered with the rest. It stood waiting, patient, like a stage without its actors. She sat in the car, a long moment, the heat ticking low, staring at the windows glowing faintly against the dusk. Inside, the boxes of ornaments waited in the attic. The angel topper lay wrapped in tissue, its porcelain face as serene as ever. Margaret thought of it sitting in the dark, waiting to be lifted onto a tree that might never come. She closed her eyes and whispered into the stillness of the car, "I gave you every Christmas I had." And in the silence that followed, she felt the echo of years' bright, warm, relentless press against her chest like ghosts. The house was dim when Margaret stepped inside, the quiet swallowing her whole. She set her purse on the counter, hung her coat on the peg by the door, and stood a moment in the entryway. The echo of Evan's words clung to her like the faint smell of coffee that lingered on her sweater. She could still see his expression, when he'd said it carefully neutral, a little too light, as though he already knew what it would do to her. But what gnawed at her even more was the shadow behind those words. Not Evan's voice, not really. Claire's, her daughter, had been part of the family for nearly a decade now, and Margaret had done everything she could to welcome her in. She had bought Claire's favorite wine for holidays, learned the recipes she mentioned offhand, even asked her opinion on things she would have once decided alone: paint colors, gifts for the kids, vacation spots. But no matter how much effort she offered, there was always a polite wall between them. Claire smiled often, but it was a smile that stopped just short of warmth. Polished, perfect, a smile that said, "I'll tolerate you, but I won't need you." Margaret remembered the first Christmas after their wedding. She had been so eager, so determined to make it special, to prove she could blend traditions instead of clashing. She had decorated the house weeks early, invited both families, cooked until her back screamed. Claire had arrived with a tray of gingerbread cookies so flawlessly decorated they looked store-bought, and with that same perfect smile had placed them beside Margaret's lopsided sugar cookies. Everyone complimented Claire's, hardly anyone touched Margaret's. She told herself it didn't matter, that there was room for both. But even then, she had felt the shift. Over the years, it became more apparent. Claire directed where the kids opened presents, when the family photo was taken, what time the meal should start. Evan followed her lead, smiling dutifully, kissing her cheek. Margaret found herself stepping aside, piece by piece, until her role was reduced to setting the table, to refilling glasses, to sitting quietly at the corner while the noise swirled around her. She told herself she didn't mind. She told herself what mattered was being there at all. But now she wasn't even that. Margaret climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under her weight. In her bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed and thought of Claire's smile. It wasn't cruel, not openly. It was never sharp, never confrontational. It was the kind of smile that could disarm anyone who dared accuse her of exclusion. How could she be accused of malice when her lips curved so sweetly, when her voice lilted with politeness, yet beneath it lay something unspoken? This is my family now. You are peripheral. Margaret had felt it at birthdays too. The way Claire guided the children toward her parents first, handing them cards to open in front of their side of the family. The way she suggested politely that Margaret might bring just one dish to the potluck, not three. The way she slipped in phrases like our traditions while looking only at her parents, not at Margaret. Each moment small, almost invisible, but together they built a wall. Sitting in the quiet, Margaret whispered the words she had been too afraid to say aloud. She doesn't want me there. Her voice cracked against the stillness. Saying it out loud made it real, and she hated herself for the bitterness that tinged it still. She thought of the children, their bright eyes, their giggles when she read them the same storybook every Christmas Eve. Would they notice her absence this year? Would they ask where Grandma was? Or would Claire's side of the family fill that space so easily that Margaret's presence wasn't missed at all? She lowered herself onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. The shadows on the plaster seemed to arrange themselves into Claire's smile, polite, and Margaret realized with a sinking ache that exclusion didn't always come dressed as cruelty. Sometimes it came wearing a grin, offering cookies, and speaking in gentle tones. Sometimes it came from a woman who never raised her voice, but who knew how to claim every corner of a holiday until there was no room left for anyone else. Margaret turned to her nightstand, pulled her journal close, and wrote a single line. Her smile has erased me. Then she closed the book, switched off the lamp, and lay in the darkness, wondering how a smile could hurt more than a scowl ever could. The engine hummed low, steady, as Margaret steered her aging sedan down the two-lane road that cut through town. December's sky hung heavy, the clouds a dull grey quilt threatening snow, and the early darkness pressed in around her. Street lamps flickered on one by one, halos of yellow light stretching across the pavement. She gripped the steering wheel, tighter than necessary, the leather cool beneath her hands. The coffee she'd forced down at the diner churned in her stomach, sour, unsettled. The drive from the diner to her house wasn't long, 15 minutes, maybe less, but it felt endless. That evening, the silence in the car was thick. Margaret usually filled it with the radio, a mix of holiday music and talk shows that kept her company. But tonight, the thought of hearing carols was unbearable. She couldn't stomach cheerful voices singing about joy, goodwill, and family gatherings when she had just been excused from her own. She pressed the button anyway, almost out of habit. The speakers crackled to life, and a familiar voice spilled into the car, Bing Crosby crooning, "I'll be home for Christmas." Margaret's throat clenched. She reached out immediately and snapped the radio off. The silence that followed was worse. Her mind replayed the lunch like a cruel loop. Evan's face calm, distracted, his tone gentle, almost careless. "We're keeping Christmas just for her side of the family this year." He had said it as if it were an inconvenience, as if she might even feel relieved not to fuss with cooking or decorating, as if she were a tired relic who needed protecting from her own traditions. She drove past a row of houses, each one glowing with decorations. Lights twinkled in bushes, reindeer figures grazed on front lawns, and wreaths hung on doors. She used to love this part of the drive, the sight of people layering brightness onto the dark. But now each bulb felt like a reminder of what she'd been barred from. Families would gather in those houses soon, laughter, smells of cinnamon, children tearing paper, and she would sit in her own quiet kitchen, with silence echoing louder than bells. At a stoplight, Margaret glanced into the car next to her. A couple sat close together, their young child bouncing in the back seat, pointing at the lights. She looked away quickly, the sight cutting too deep. She fixed her eyes on the red glow of the light ahead, waiting for it to turn. Her hands ached from the grip on the wheel, so she loosened them, flexing her fingers. She caught her reflection faintly in the side window. The lines etched into her face looked sharper in the dim light, her eyes tired, her lips pressed too tight. For a moment, she hardly recognized herself. The woman staring back looked like someone on the verge of vanishing, still present, still breathing, but fading into the background of her own life. The light changed. She pressed the accelerator, and the car rolled forward, tires crunching over a thin sheet of ice. Her house wasn't far now. She rehearsed the motions she would take: park the car, climb the steps, unlock the door. She would set her purse on the counter, put the kettle on for tea, pretend everything was fine. That was what she'd always done. Pretend until it became bearable. But tonight, as she turned onto her street, she realized that pretending might not work this time. The words she'd heard weren't just careless, they were final. A line had been drawn, and she had been left on the other side of it. Her porch light glowed faintly as she pulled into the driveway. She cut the engine, but she didn't move right away. The silence in the car pressed in on her chest. She wrapped her arms around herself and whispered, barely audible, "Where do I go now?" The question lingered as she stepped out into the cold evening air, her breath rising in small clouds. The house loomed ahead, familiar and foreign all at once. She had never noticed how lonely it looked with its dark windows and undecorated yard. Tonight it seemed to mirror her exactly, standing, intact, but hollow. Margaret climbed the steps slowly, each one creaking under her weight. She unlocked the door, pushed it open, and let the warmth of the house envelop her. But it was not comfort. She felt it was the weight of the drive home, the realization that Christmas lights could shine all around her and still never touch her. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing out the cold, but the air inside the house felt no warmer. Margaret stood in the narrow entryway, her hand still resting on the knob as though she might turn and leave again. The house smelled faintly of lavender detergent and the stale trace of last night's tea. It was tidy, as it always was, shoes lined neatly by the door, the Afghan folded square on the arm of the couch. The silence pressed tight across every room. She slipped out of her coat and hung it on the peg. The weight fell away from her shoulders, but the ache inside her ribs only deepened. Her purse thudded softly onto the counter, and for a long moment she simply stood there, staring at nothing, listening to the hollow tick of the kitchen clock. The house had never seemed so large. Each room opened into the next, like a stage set, waiting for actors who would never arrive. The living room with its worn recliner and bookcase full of old paperbacks. The dining room with its table stretched to fit 6, though it had not been filled in years. And upstairs, bedrooms emptied of the life they once held of Vince's childhood room, still decorated with posters of rock bands that had long since faded from popularity. The bed neatly made, untouched. She wandered toward the living room, her slippers whispering against the floorboards. On the coffee table sat a box she had pulled down from the attic a week earlier. Inside, ornaments, weighted glass bulbs wrapped in tissue, paper crafts Evan had made in elementary school, the angel topper that had once been the centerpiece of every December. She had opened the box with the intention of decorating, but hadn't made it past lifting the first ornament. Now the box sat open, a quiet accusation. She lowered herself onto the couch and touched one of the ornaments, a painted ceramic bell, chipped at the edge. Evan had made it when he was 8, his name scrawled across the bottom in crooked letters. She remembered how proud he had been to hang it on the tree. Margaret traced the faded paint with her fingertip, her chest tightening. Would he even remember it now? Would he tell his own children about the bell? About the years when the tree in this very room had been the center of his world? Her eyes drifted to the corner where the tree usually stood, its absence glaring. For decades, that space had been filled with branches and lights, with piles of gifts that seemed impossibly tall on Christmas morning. Now it was only a bare stretch of wall, the paint slightly discolored from where the tree had leaned year after year. Margaret tried to picture it full again, but the image faltered. The silence pressed in thicker as the evening deepened. She switched on the lamp, but the light felt harsh, sterile, doing nothing to soften the emptiness. She filled the kettle out of habit, set it on the stove, and waited for the whistle. The sound came sharp, almost startling in the quiet, and she poured water over a tea bag, the steam fogging her glasses. She carried the mug back to the couch, wrapping her hands around it, staring at the box of ornaments. The tea tasted flat. She sipped anyway, needing something to hold. Her gaze fell on the stockings, folded neatly in a drawer beneath the television stand. She hadn't pulled them out yet. One bore Evan's name, stitched in red yarn by her own hands. She had imagined, one day, stitching names for grandchildren too, but that drawer had stayed closed, the stockings unused. This year, it would remain so. Margaret leaned back against the couch and let out a long, uneven breath. The house seemed to breathe with her, groaning faintly as the heat clicked on, the pipes rattling in protest. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she could almost hear Eco's children's laughter, the crinkle of wrapping paper, Michael's voice before he left for good. But when she opened them again, the house was still. She whispered into the room, her voice barely more than a thread. "I don't know how to do this without you." She didn't know if she meant Evan, or Michael, or the version of herself, who had once believed Christmas was unshakable. The tea cooled in her hands. She set it down beside the box of ornaments and sat in the silence, the house around her vast and empty, a reminder of how quickly joy could be packed away, how easily tradition could be erased. Upstairs, the night stretched long and restless. Margaret sat at her desk by the bedroom window, the pale glow of a lamp casting her shadow against the wall. Outside, the neighborhood was alive with holiday color strings of twinkling lights draped across porches, inflatable Santas bobbing in the wind, the faint silhouette of a Christmas tree glowing through the curtains across the street. From her vantage, it all looked staged, like a play she was no longer cast in. She opened the drawer and pulled out her journal. The cover was worn, its edges softened by years of use. Inside were pages filled with everything she hadn't said aloud, private confessions, fragments of prayers, questions written in shaky script. The journal had been her anchor through Michael's leaving, through years of raising Evan alone, through illnesses and recoveries. Tonight, it felt heavier than usual, as if it carried the silence of the entire house between its covers. She smoothed a fresh page, uncapped her pen, and stared at the blank lines. For a long time, her hand refused to move. What words could possibly hold the weight of what she felt? Her son's sentence replayed in her mind. "We're keeping Christmas just for her side of the family." It was so ordinary on the surface, so polite, but it rang like exile. Finally, she pressed the pen down, her script jagged, uneven. December 10th. Christmas is not mine anymore. I wonder when it stopped being. The ink pooled slightly where her hand trembled. She paused, the words stark against the page, and thought back through the years. Was it when Claire first joined the family and rearranged the seating at dinner? Was it when Evan stopped asking her opinion on gifts for the children? Or had it begun earlier, when he left for college, and Christmas became the only tether she had to him? Perhaps it had been slipping away all along, one thread at a time, until tonight she finally saw the fabric torn. She wrote again, slower this time. "I have been replaced by convenience. I am not part of easy." The pen scratched loudly in the quiet. She listened to the sound, steadying herself with it. The act of writing felt like proof. She was still here, still present, still capable of putting her truth into the world, even if no one else would hear it. She set the pen down, rubbed her hands over her face. The clock ticked toward midnight. Her tea from earlier sat cold on the nightstand, untouched. She reached for it anyway, took a sip, grimaced at the bitterness, then set it aside again. Her eyes drifted back to the page. She read her words once, twice, then added more. "I carried Christmas on my shoulders for decades. I made it glow when there was no money, no help, no husband. I baked when my hands ached, smiled when my heart cracked, stayed up all night to keep the magic alive. I did it so Evan would always have a place where joy lived. Now he has decided that joy belongs elsewhere. I wonder if he knows what he has done, or if he'll only realize when I am gone." Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had learned long ago not to let herself collapse. Even grief, she believed, should be organized, folded neatly like laundry. She closed the journal gently, resting her hand on the cover. Across the street, her neighbor's lights flickered off, one by one. The street fell into darkness. Margaret switched off her lamp, slid into bed, and pulled the quilt up around her shoulders. In the dark, she whispered the words she had just written, as though speaking them aloud might make them truer, or perhaps lighter. "Christmas is not mine anymore." The ceiling above her was blank and unyielding. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence of the house until, finally, it swallowed her into sleep. The morning light slipped weakly through the curtains, pale and grey, the kind of winter sun that never quite managed to warm a room. Margaret rose slowly, her body stiff from a night of tossing and turning, and padded into the kitchen. The kettle hissed on the stove, filling the silence with its familiar comfort. But even the ritual of tea couldn't soften the heaviness pressing against her chest. She carried her mug to the living room, where the box of ornaments still sat, open on the coffee table. She hadn't been able to bring herself to move it the night before, and now it greeted her like an unfinished sentence. She lowered herself onto the couch, curling her hands around the mug, and stared at the shapes peeking out from inside. Something in her resisted the thought of leaving them untouched. She set down her tea, pulled the box closer, and began peeling back layers of yellowed paper. One by one, memories surfaced. A glass ball flecked with glitter, cracked at the base. A felt Santa stitched clumsily by Evan in second grade. An ornament, shaped like a book, given to her by a co-worker at the library decades ago. Each piece was heavy with time, heavy with the weight of all the Christmases she had built from nothing. Her hand lingered on a photo ornament Evan at 6 years old, grinning wide, a smear of chocolate across his cheek. His hair stuck out in cowlicks, his eyes bright, his cheeks pink from running around the living room. She remembered that year vividly. Money had been so tight she could barely afford the tree. She had worked overtime at the library, stretching every dollar, but she had managed it. On Christmas morning, his delight had been boundless, as though he'd been given the world. Margaret traced the edge of the frame with her thumb. Where had that little boy gone? The boy who used to sit cross-legged by the fireplace, clutching mugs of cocoa she made too sweet. The boy who whispered his Christmas list in her ear because he didn't trust Santa to get it right. That boy had grown into a man who now sat across from her at diners, talking about other people's traditions, other people's tables, and dismissing hers without a second thought. The ache was sharp, but it was paired with something else, gratitude, because those memories, however painful now, were hers. Nothing could erase the years she had fought to make holidays magical, not even her son's indifference. She reached deeper into the box and found an old photo album wedged at the bottom. Its cover was cracked, the plastic peeling from the corners. She pulled it out, wiped a layer of dust away, and opened it carefully. The first page bloomed with color. Photos of Evan in footed pajamas tearing into gifts. Michael lifting him onto his shoulders to place the angel on the tree. Margaret herself, in the background, smiling despite the exhaustion etched into her eyes. She turned page after page, watching the boy grow taller. The tree decorated differently each year, the stockings always the same. She lingered on one photo of the three of them before Michael left, a rare, candid shot where they were all laughing, heads tilted back, caught in the middle of some forgotten joke. Margaret's throat tightened. She pressed her palm against the photo, feeling the smoothness of the plastic. Time had carried them so far from that moment, and yet, looking at it, she could almost hear their laughter again. A tear slid down her cheek, and she let it fall. For once, she didn't blink it back. She whispered softly to the photo, to the boy frozen inside it. "I tried, Evan. I tried to give you everything." The kettle clicked off in the kitchen, long forgotten. Margaret closed the album gently, resting it on her lap. The past had come to sit with her that morning, not cruelly, not to taunt, but to remind her of the love she had poured out year after year, the traditions she had built, the family she had fought to hold together. Even if she was no longer invited to the table, she realized she had once created it, and that mattered, that would always matter. She picked up her pen and opened her journal once more. On the fresh page, she wrote, December 11th. Today I remembered. Christmas was mine once, and no one can take that from me. She closed the book, laid her hand over it, and sat very still, letting the memories settle like dust in the morning light. By the time afternoon rolled in, the quiet of the house had settled. Heavy on Margaret's shoulders, she busied herself with chores that didn't need doing, wiping already clean counters, straightening books that were aligned perfectly, running her hand along the mantel as if dusting when there was nothing to sweep away, anything to keep from sinking fully into the silence. A knock startled her, sharp, sudden, almost foreign. Margaret froze in the hallway, rag still in hand. Visitors were rare, especially unannounced ones. She hesitated, listening. The knock came, again, gentler this time, followed by a voice muffled through the door. "Margaret, it's Ruth from next door." She exhaled, relief mixing with a flicker of apprehension. Ruth had lived beside her for nearly 20 years, a widow with a laugh that carried across their adjoining yards in summer. They had traded cookies at Christmas time, exchanged plants in spring, shared neighborly chats over the fence. Lately, though, Margaret had kept her distance. She didn't want anyone seeing how thinly she was stretched. She opened the door. Pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, Ruth stood there in a long wool coat, a scarf wound brightly around her neck, her cheeks flushed from the cold. In her hands was a tin wrapped with red ribbon. "I thought I'd bring these by," Ruth said, her smile wide and warm. Ginger snaps just came out of the oven. The smell drifted toward Margaret, sharp with molasses and spice. For a moment, she didn't trust her voice. "That's kind of you," she managed, taking the tin. The warmth seeped into her palms, almost startling after the chill of the house. Ruth tilted her head, studying her. "I was wondering. A few of us are gathering at the community hall next Friday. Nothing fancy, just potluck and carols. You should come. It'd be good to see you there." Margaret's instinct was to retreat, to politely decline, to offer some excuse about being busy. The idea of stepping into a room filled with people singing about joy when hers had been taken from her felt unbearable. But Ruth's eyes held a gentle insistence, not pushy, just present. "I don't know," Margaret said softly, her fingers tightening around the tin. Ruth reached out, touched her arm lightly. "You don't have to decide now. Just think about it. We'd love to have you." Margaret nodded, promising nothing. And after a few more words, Ruth left, her footsteps crunching across the snow back to her own house. Margaret stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold air curling around her ankles. Before finally closing it, she carried the tin into the kitchen and set it on the counter. Carefully, she pulled at the ribbon, lifted the lid. The cookies were golden, edges crisp, dusted lightly with sugar. She picked one up and took a bite. The sweetness spread across her tongue, unexpected tears pricking her eyes. It wasn't just the taste, it was the reminder that someone had thought of her, had chosen to reach out. She leaned against the counter, chewing slowly. The house still felt empty, but for the first time in days, the silence was broken by something softer. A neighbor's knock, a ribboned tin, an invitation. Margaret knew she wasn't ready to say yes, not yet, but as she wrapped the tin again and placed it carefully on the table, she let herself imagine walking into that hall, seeing familiar faces, joining a song. The thought didn't heal the wound, but it soothed it, like a balm pressed gently against raw skin. She returned to the living room, the box of ornaments still open, the photo album resting nearby. She touched the album lightly, then glanced at the journal on her nightstand. Perhaps, she thought, there was still time to write about this moment. Toother, unexpected kindness, the way ginger snaps could remind a person they weren't invisible. The afternoon waned, shadows stretching across the room. Margaret sat quietly, cookie crumbs on her palm, and for the first time since that diner lunch, she didn't feel completely alone. The invitation lingered in her mind, a small spark against the dark, waiting for her to decide whether to fan it into flame. That night, the house was hushed again, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old wood shifting under the cold. Margaret sat in her armchair, the phone on the table beside her, lit faintly by the lamp. She had picked it up twice already, thumb hovering over the familiar number. Both times, she had set it down again, her chest tightening at the thought of his voice. Evan. The urge to call him pulsed like a second heartbeat, to demand an explanation, to ask how he could so casually cast her aside, to remind him of all the Christmases she had built for him from the ground up, of the stockings, the carols, the meals she'd stretched from little to enough. She wanted to pour the ache into words, to let him feel, even for a second, the weight of what he had done. But each time her thumb lingered over the numbers, a wall rose in her mind. His sigh, his polite tone, his distracted half-smile. "Mom, it's just one Christmas. Or worse, don't make this harder than it needs to be." She feared his dismissal more than the silence, so instead, she sat, the phone within reach, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She listened to the hollow quiet, and thought of what she would say if courage took her by the shoulders. "Do you remember the year you begged for a train set? Evan, I sold my grandmother's brooch to buy it. You never knew, and I never told you, because the joy on your face was worth every sacrifice. Do you remember the year the snowstorm knocked the power out, and we lit candles and sang carols by the fireplace? You said it was the best Christmas you ever had. Do you remember how I stayed up all night stitching stockings so you would believe Santa himself had left them?" Her throat closed around the words she never spoke. She reached for her journal instead, pulling it into her lap, uncapping her pen. If she couldn't speak to him, she could at least write to him. December 12th. Tonight, I thought of calling you. I wanted to tell you what your words did to me. But I know you'd brush it aside, not out of cruelty, but because you don't understand. You don't know that every Christmas I made was a shield against the emptiness, a promise that you would never feel what I felt when your father left. You don't know how much of myself I poured into those days, how much of my life's meaning is bound in tinsel and candlelight. The pen scratched across the page, steady and insistent. She pressed harder, the ink sinking deep into the fibers. You say Christmas is for her family now. Perhaps that's true. Perhaps I am too much work, too much memory, too much of the past. But if you ever think back, if you ever wonder who held it all together before Claire's smile, before her family filled the space, remember, it was me. Remember, it was always me. Her hand trembled as she signed her name at the bottom of the page, as though she were writing a letter he might one day read. She closed the journal slowly, resting her palm on its worn cover. The phone still sat beside her, silent. She reached out, touched it lightly, then drew her hand back. Not tonight, maybe not ever. The distance between them felt wider than the miles that separated their houses. Margaret leaned back in the chair, closing her eyes. The silence pressed in, but this time it was filled with her own voice, her words etched onto paper, undeniable, unerasable. If Evan never heard them, at least they existed. At least the truth had been spoken, even if only to herself. And in the quiet, she realized that sometimes the hardest call wasn't the one you made. It was the one you did in single quotes. The following morning, Margaret found herself drawn back to the attic. She hadn't been up there in months. The narrow pull-down ladder groaned as she descended it from its hiding place in the ceiling. A draft of cold air rushed down, carrying with it the scent of cardboard, cedar, and years gone by. She hesitated at the foot of the ladder, hand on the rung, asking herself what exactly she was looking for. Maybe distraction, maybe proof that her life had been more than the emptiness she felt now. She climbed carefully, each step creaking under her weight, until her head poked through the opening. The attic was dim, lit only by a single bare bulb strung on a cord. Dust floated like slow snowflakes through the beam of light. Around her, boxes and bins stood in uneven stacks, their sides labeled in faded marker: Easter, winter coats, kitchenware, Christmas. She made her way to the far corner, where the holiday boxes were piled tallest. She pulled one closer, her fingers stiff from the cold, and lifted the lid. Inside lay wreaths, strings of tangled lights, and garlands that had dulled with age. Beneath them, wrapped carefully in layers of paper, were decorations she hadn't touched in years. Margaret sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, unwrapping each relic of her life. A set of wooden nutcrackers, chipped and missing paint. A snow globe, from a trip to New York with Michael before Evan was born. When she shook it, the flakes swirled sluggishly, as if reluctant to fall. A candle shaped like a church, wick unused, gifted by her mother decades ago. Each item held a weight heavier than its form, pulling her backward through time. One box at the bottom caught her attention. It was smaller, tucked away, its tape brittle. With age, she peeled it back carefully. Inside were photographs, old prints that hadn't been placed in albums, just left in a pile, curling at the edges. She sifted through them, the images pulling her into another world. There was one of her and Michael decorating their very first tree in the tiny apartment they rented when they were newly married. She could see her own face, youthful and bright, her hands raised as she stretched to hang a star. Michael's arms encircled her waist, his smile easy. She had forgotten that smile, the way it made her believe the future would be golden. Another photo showed Evan as a toddler, tugging at a string of lights, his face alight with mischief. In the background, Margaret stood bent over a box, weary, but laughing. That year she had worked 2 jobs to make sure his stocking was filled. She remembered collapsing into bed after midnight, every bone aching but still humming carols under her breath. As she looked at the photos, she realized how many Christmases had passed in sacrifice. Each one was a chapter of her devotion, a testament to her ability to hold a family together with little more than determination. These were her ghosts, not haunting her, but reminding her that her life had been for Levin, if no one else seemed to remember. Her hands trembled as she placed the photos back in the box, her breath visible in the cold air. She whispered to the shadows around her, "You mattered. You all mattered." The words echoed softly in the rafters. Margaret closed the box gently, slid it back where she had found it, and stood. As she made her way down the ladder, she felt the ache of loss, but also a strange steadiness. The ghosts of Christmases past had not come to accuse her. They had come to affirm her. Back in the warmth of the house, she sat at the kitchen table. With her journal, she wrote, December 13th, my house is full of ghosts, but they are kind. They remind me that love once lived here, brightly, stubbornly, year after year. Perhaps that love has shifted elsewhere now. But it was mine first. It was real. She laid down her pen and closed her eyes, listening not to silence this time, but to the faint echoes of laughter, wrapping paper, and the crackle of long-dead fires. The past was gone, but it wasn't lost. It had built her, brick by brick, and though the present felt hollow, she carried within her the undeniable proof that once she had created joy out of nothing and that mattered still. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived in the mail, its front decorated with golden stars and neat calligraphy. Margaret knew before she opened it whose handwriting graced the address. Claire's, her daughter-in-law. Even the sight of it sent a twist through her stomach. She sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of her, hesitating before sliding her finger under the flap. The card inside was glossy, its cover showing Evan, Claire, and the 2 children posed in matching red sweaters by a fireplace that was not hers. The stockings behind them were embroidered with names: Evan, Claire, Lily, and Jonah. No sign that Margaret existed. No space for her name among the bright letters stitched in gold. She stared at the photo for a long while, tracing the edges with her thumb. Her grandchildren's smiles were genuine, wide with innocence. Lily's front teeth were missing, Jonah's hair a wild mess despite Claire's attempts to tame it. They looked happy radiantly, unmistakably happy. But the joy stabbed at Margaret, like a shard of ice, because she wasn't there. She hadn't been asked to pose in the background, to hold one of the children, to simply be present. She had been erased. Inside, the message was scripted in Claire's handwriting, wishing you a Merry Christmas filled with love and light. We'll miss seeing you this year, but no, we're thinking of you. A flourish of Claire's signature followed, and at the bottom Evan had added a quick note: Love you, Mom. That was all. 3 words. A fragment, a token thrown her way. Margaret pressed the card closed and sat in silence, the house pressing in tight around her. Her first thought was anger, hot, bitter, rising up her throat. How dare Claire send this, knowing full well what she had taken from her? How dare Evan allow his wife to push her aside as though she were a relic, something to be acknowledged only in polite gestures? But anger soon gave way to grief, a heavier thing sinking into her bones. She reached for her journal, flipping it open to a clean page. The words spilled out almost before she could think them. December 16th. The card arrived today. A family portrait. Complete. Without me, it is not absence, it is exclusion. They smile as if I do not exist, as if all the years I gave have no weight, no claim. My son writes, love you, Mom, as if those 3 words can patch over a wound he does not even see. Her hand trembled, ink smudging slightly on the paper. She paused, wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, and kept going. Do they believe love is a word on paper, that a card is enough to tether me to them? Love is not a word. It is stockings stitched by tired hands. It is bills paid late so presents could be bought. It is laughter conjured out of thin air to hide the hunger in the cupboards. That is love. And yet, in their home, in their portrait, I am nowhere to be found. Margaret set the pen down and looked again at the photograph. She wanted to rip it in half, to shred it into ribbons, to cast it into the fireplace. Instead, she pressed it against her chest, tears streaking silently down her cheeks. Because despite everything, those were still her grandchildren. That was still her son. After a while, she placed the card back in its envelope and tucked it into the drawer of her desk. Not on the mantel, where it would mock her each time she passed, but not in the trash either. She couldn't quite bring herself to destroy it. As evening fell, she sat by the window, looking out at the neighbors' lights glowing cheerfully across the street. She thought of Ruth's invitation to the potluck, of the ginger snaps waiting on her counter. For the first time, the idea of walking into a room that was not her family's but might still hold warmth felt less impossible. She whispered into the dim light, her voice steady despite the tears drying on her cheeks. If they won't see me, I'll find somewhere else to be seen. It wasn't defiance exactly, but it was the beginning of something, an ember sparking in the ashes of what she had lost. The next morning, Margaret stood in her living room, staring at the mantel, as if it were a stranger. For decades, that narrow strip of wood had been the center of her Christmas universe. Stockings lined up in perfect order, garlands trailing with care, candles flickering in brass holders she'd polished each year until they gleamed every December. It had been her stage, the place where her love was made visible in thread, ribbon, and light. Now it was bare. A faint outline of dust marked where the stockings had once hung. She could see it clearly, 5 faint rectangles against the wood. Hers, Evan's, Michael's before he left, and later the 2 she had sewn for her grandchildren. She could almost picture them swaying in the draft when the door opened, could almost hear the rustle of little hands reaching eagerly inside. But the mantel held nothing now. No stockings, no garland, no candles, just wood and dust, stripped of memory. Margaret pressed her fingertips against the surface, tracing the outlines, like one might touch a scar. The silence of the room felt heavier here, as though the absence of color and decoration had multiplied it. She thought of the card tucked away in her drawer, of the smiling faces in front of someone else's fireplace, their stockings neatly embroidered without hers. For a moment, bitterness surged. She wanted to curse the mantel, to denounce it as nothing more than wood, to insist it meant nothing without the people it once served. But as she stood there, she couldn't help but remember. The mantel wasn't just decoration. It was a chronicle. It had held her joy and her sorrow. It had borne witness to Evan's wide-eyed delight, to Michael's brief laughter, to her own stubborn determination to keep the season alive, even when money or hope ran thin. She went to the closet and pulled out a box of decorations she hadn't touched yet. Inside were 2 stockings, Lily's and Jonah's, carefully stitched years ago. She held them in her hands, the fabric soft, the letters of their names slightly frayed from use. She lifted them to her face, breathing in the faint scent of cedar from storage, her heart clenched. These were symbols of her place in their lives, and now they were orphaned. Margaret lowered herself into the armchair with the stockings draped across her lap. Her fingers smoothed the fabric again and again, as though touch might restore their meaning. She whispered their names aloud, Lily, Jonah, just 2. Feel them in the room with her. The sound echoed back, fragile but grounding. After a long silence, she rose and carried the stockings to the mantel. She hung them there carefully, using the old brass hooks that had never been removed. They sagged slightly, too few, too lonely without the others beside them. But they were something, a statement that she still existed, that her love still had a place, even if no one came to claim it. Margaret stepped back, looking at the mantel with its 2 lone stockings. The sight broke her heart and steadied it at the same time. She whispered, "You'll always have a place here." Her eyes stung, but she didn't look away. Later, she opened her journal and wrote, December 17th. The mantel is empty now, except for 2 stockings. They hang like questions, like ghosts of children who may never run to this fireplace again. But I could not leave the wood bare. I could not let the dust win. If they forget me, I will not forget them. My love will hang here, as long as I have strength to place it. She closed the book and returned to the mantel, where the stockings swayed gently in the draught. The emptiness of the room remained, but it was no longer absolute. Something small had returned, a flicker of presence, stitched in red and white, declaring quietly that she had not vanished. And for the first time in days, Margaret allowed herself to sit by the fire, light a candle, and simply watch the shadows dance across the walls, knowing the mantel was not entirely empty after all. That evening, the sky bruised purple and black as the sun slipped behind the rooftops, leaving the street. Outside Margaret's house swallowed in winter dark, she moved through her rooms with slow purpose, pulling curtains tight, setting the kettle on, and glancing now and then at the 2 stockings that hung solemnly from the mantel. Their presence steadied her, though it also left her aching with questions. She reached into the sideboard drawer and pulled out an old brass candlestick. It was dented along the base, its polish dulled with years of handling, but it had been her mother's, and her mother's before her. In her family, the tradition had always been to place a candle in the window at Christmas time. Her mother used to say it was a light to guide loved ones home, a signal that no matter how far they had gone, they were still welcome. Margaret had not lit that candle in years. The habit had faded after Michael left, and once Evan married Claire, she thought of it less and less. But tonight, The emptiness pressed so hard against her chest that she needed something, a gesture, a defiance, a reminder that her love hadn't been erased. She set the candlestick on the windowsill, straightened it, and struck a match. The wick sputtered before catching, and then a small flame rose, wavering against the glass. Its light spread slowly across the room, chasing the shadows from the corners. Outside, the snow reflected the glow, making the street seem a little softer, a little less cold. Margaret stood there, watching the flame, her arms folded tightly around herself. She imagined Lily and Jonah walking down the street one day, seeing that candle, and knowing instinctively it was for them that their grandmother was waiting, hoping, watching. She imagined Evan too, glancing at the window as he drove past. Recognizing the signal he'd long forgotten, the thought pulled tears to her eyes. She whispered into the quiet, "This is still your home. Even if you don't walk through the door, the light will be here." Her throat tightened, and she turned away before the weight of it could crush her. She made her tea, carried it into the living room, and sat where she could still see the flicker against the window pane. The stockings on the mantel and the candle in the window seemed to speak to each other across the room, fragile testaments of her place in the world. She pulled her journal closer and began to write, her pen steady despite the heaviness in her chest. December 18th. Tonight I lit the candle. My mother taught me it was a light for those who had lost their way home. Perhaps Evan will never see it. Perhaps the children won't know, but I do. I know that I have not given up on them. The world may forget what mothers build, but the flame remembers. It carries memory forward, past silence, past distance, past being set aside. She paused, her gaze lifting back to the flickering glow. There is something holy in a single flame against the dark. It does not roar, it does not shout, but it refuses to vanish. That is what I want to be. Not gone, not silent, still burning, however small. She closed the journal and leaned back in her chair, her tea cooling in her hands. The house was still, quiet, but the candle hummed in its own way, its light pressing gently outward. Margaret sat there long into the evening, the flame keeping her company. At times, she swore it seemed to grow, as if it were fed not by wax but by memory itself, which Christmas passed, each stocking stitched, each laugh and tear she had carried through the years. And though she remained alone in her house, the darkness outside felt less absolute. Somewhere within it, she imagined, the light might be seen. Somewhere, it might matter. And if not, then it mattered here, to her, tonight. 2 days before Christmas, Margaret forced herself out of the house. She told herself she only needed groceries, milk, bread, tea, but the truth was, the silence had grown unbearable. The candles still burned each night in the window, but daylight hours stretched long and hollow. She bundled herself in her wool coat and scarf, pulled on gloves, and stepped into the brittle air of late December. The town's market was crowded. People bustled between stalls, their arms full of wreaths, poinsettias, and last-minute gifts. Children tugged at mittens, their laughter rising over the clatter of car doors and shopping bags. Margaret moved slowly among them, her steps measured, her list clutched in her gloved hand. At the bakery stall, she reached for a loaf of bread, just as another hand brushed hers. She looked up to see a man about her age, silver-haired with kind eyes, smiling apologetically. "Sorry," he said, withdrawing his hand. "Didn't mean to startle you." "It's fine," Margaret replied softly, pulling the loaf toward her. She expected the moment to end there, but the man lingered, studying her with a familiar sort of recognition. "You're Margaret Ellis, aren't you? You taught my daughter." "Oh, must be 30 years ago now. 5th grade. Emily Carter." Margaret blinked, surprised. "Emily Carter," she repeated, sifting through her memory. A small girl with pigtails and a love for reading surfaced in her mind. Of course, she loved Jane Austen before most children even knew the name. The man laughed. "That's her. She still does. She's an editor now, in Boston. Talks about you often, actually. Said you were the teacher who made her believe she could make a life out of books." Margaret felt a warmth stir in her chest, fragile but real. That's kind of her to remember. The man extended his hand. "I'm Thomas. I run the hardware store now. Emily's home for Christmas. You should stop by, if you'd like. She'd be thrilled to see you." The invitation startled Margaret. She hadn't expected connection to appear here, between loaves of bread and the bustle of strangers. She hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Her instinct was to retreat, to smile politely and excuse herself. but Thomas's expression held no pity, only sincerity. "I'll think about it," she said at last, her voice low. He nodded, as though that were enough. "Either way, it was good to see you, Margaret. Merry Christmas." She watched him walk away, the crowd folding round him until he disappeared. Her hand lingered on the bread, the weight of his words pressing into her. "She talks about you often." After so many days of feeling erased, here was proof that she had left an imprint. Somewhere, her influence lived on, still shaping lives. Margaret continued her shopping in a daze. She bought tea and fruit, a small bag of walnuts, even a sprig of holly she hadn't planned on. Each item felt less like necessity and more like a gift to herself, as though Thomas's recognition had given her permission to care again, even in small ways. When she returned home, she set the holly on the table, its red berries bright against the dull wood. She lit the candle in the window and sat beside it, her journal open on her lap. December 22nd. Today at the market, I was reminded, I am not invisible. A student remembered, a father remembered. My life has left marks I cannot always see, but they are there. Perhaps my son forgets, perhaps my place in his home is gone, but elsewhere, I remain. A light flickers in Boston because of me. That is something, that is enough, for tonight. She placed her pen down and looked at the candle, its flame steady against the glass. For the first time in weeks, she felt not just the ache of loss, but the quiet pulse of worth. And when she looked at the holly, bright and defiant on the table, she thought maybe there was still a kind of Christmas waiting for her, even here, even now. The next afternoon, Margaret decided to walk through the square before heading home. She told herself it was for the exercise, but part of her wanted to feel the hum of life again, even from a distance. The square was strung with lights, a great pine tree at its center glittering with ornaments donated by townsfolk. Beneath it, a small stage had been erected, and she noticed a group of people gathering, some older, some young, carrying folders of music. She paused at the edge, watching, as the local choir arranged themselves. They were rehearsing for the Christmas Eve service. She realized, voices rising in scattered fragments, as they warmed up. A woman in a red scarf waved her arms to gather attention, calling out notes. Then the music began, soft at first, then fuller, a swell of voices that reached into the cold air and wrapped around the square dot. Margaret stood rooted. The song was "Oh Come, All the Faithful," a carol she had sung every year when Evan was small. She remembered standing in church with him beside her, his child's voice piping up enthusiastically, often off-key, but always earnest. He used to tug her sleeve, grinning, asking if they could sing it again when they got home. Hearing it now, Margaret felt something shift inside her. The voices blended into one sound, rising over the clatter of the square. People stopped to listen, children with sticky hands clutching candy canes, couples holding cups of mulled cider. Some sang along softly, others simply smiled. For a moment, Margaret forgot her grief. The music lifted her, as if the sound itself were carrying her forward. She wasn't excluded here. She wasn't forgotten. She was simply another soul standing in the cold, warmed by voices that made no distinction between who was worthy and who was not. When the choir finished, applause rippled through the crowd. Margaret found herself clapping too, the sound breaking something open in her chest. As the group shuffled their papers, preparing for the next song, a young woman in the alto section caught Margaret's eye. She smiled, a small, unassuming smile, but it was enough to make Margaret feel seen. The second song began, "Silent Night." This time, the choir invited the crowd to join. Margaret hesitated, her lips parting, then closing again. But when the voices swelled, she let herself hum at first, then softly formed the words. Her voice was thin, shaky, but it was there. She sang into the winter air, blending with strangers, her sound swallowed but not erased. The memory of her bare mantle, the stockings, the candle, all of it folded into the music. She realized that Christmas was larger than her pain, larger than the rejection she had suffered. It was in these voices, these notes, rising above loneliness and disappointment. It was something she could still touch, if only she allowed herself to. When the rehearsal ended, Margaret lingered as people dispersed. She almost turned to leave when the woman in the red scarf, the choir director, approached her. "You have a lovely voice," the woman said, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Margaret blinked, startled. "Oh, I wasn't high, was just humming along all the same," the director said kindly. "We're always looking for new members. If you'd like to join, even just for the service, you'd be welcome. She pressed a small flyer into Margaret's hand before turning back to gather her singers. Margaret looked down at the paper, the words blurring slightly through her tears. Community choir, rehearsals Thursdays, all are welcome. She tucked the flyer into her pocket, her fingers curling around it like a secret treasure. That night, when she lit the candle in the window, she wrote in her journal, December 23rd. Music does not ask who belongs. It simply carries us if we let it. Today I sang, in the cold, and for a moment, I was not alone. They invited me back. I may not go, but the invitation itself feels like a gift, the kind you cannot wrap. But that lingers all the same. She closed the journal and sat quietly, humming the last notes of Silent Night. The melody filled her house, soft but persistent, like the flame in the window, refusing to vanish. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, Margaret felt the weight of the season pressing more sharply than ever. The day began grey, with snow drifting down in lazy spirals, softening the rooftops and fences into quiet whiteness. All across town, families prepared cars pulled into driveways heavy with gifts. The smell of roasts wafted from chimneys, and bells rang faintly from the church steeple. Margaret moved through her house deliberately, her steps echoing in the stillness. She had made small gestures toward festivity. The 2 stockings still hung from the mantel. The sprig of holly remained bright on her table, and the candle in the window glowed faintly as the sun dimmed. But the silence between those symbols felt vast. She brewed tea, poured it into her favorite mug, the one Evan had painted for her in elementary school. The glaze was chipped, the colors faded, but she held it like an anchor. She carried it to the chair by the fire, sitting as she had so many evenings before, though tonight felt different. Tonight, she was meant to be elsewhere, in a house filled with laughter that no longer included her. She allowed herself to imagine it. Claire bustling in the kitchen, Evan carving the roast, Lily and Jonah tearing into presents with squeals of delight. She could almost hear the chatter, smell the food, see the glow of the fireplace that was not hers. She pressed her mug to her lips, swallowing against the sharp sting of being absent from the picture she once painted year after year. When dusk fell, Margaret turned on the radio for company. Carols drifted through the speakers, their familiar notes tugging at her heart. "Have yourself a merry little Christmas" played, the words a bittersweet echo. "Someday soon we all will be together, if the fates allow." The irony was sharp enough to make her laugh, low, humorless, but real. She rose and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The house seemed to grow colder, though the fire crackled dutifully. She lit another candle, this one on the table, beside her chair, its flame joining the one already burning in the window. She thought of her mother's voice, "Light guides them home." Would anyone see her light tonight? At 8 o'clock, church bells tolled, calling people to the Christmas Eve service. Margaret considered going. She could walk the few blocks, sit among strangers, hear the choir she had glimpsed only days before, but her legs felt heavy, her courage thinner than the snow on the street. Instead, she remained by the window, watching through the glass as neighbors hurried past in scarves and coats, children chattering, adults carrying casseroles and gifts. She envied them, not just for their company, but for their certainty that they belonged somewhere, that someone waited for them inside a warm house. For her, there was no door to knock on, no voice expecting her arrival. Margaret picked up her journal, opening to a fresh page. Her hand trembled as she wrote, December 24th, Christmas Eve. I sit alone in my chair with tea gone cold, listening to songs that promise joy. I have hung stockings no one will touch, lit candles no one will see. The house is too quiet, but still I try to remember what once was. Once, my son's voice filled these walls. Once, laughter rose from this mantle. Once, I mattered. Tonight, I am left with memory. Is it enough? I do not know. Her pen hovered, and she let out a long breath before continuing. But I will not snuff the candle. I will not pull down the stockings. They remain not for them, perhaps, but for me. Proof that I still hold love inside me, even when it is not returned. If no one walks through the door, the light will still burn. That will be my offering. When she set the journal aside, Margaret sat back and let the radio fill the silence again. Outside, the snow fell thicker, blanketing the world in a hush. She pulled the blanket over her knees, eyes fixed on the candle in the window, its flame steady against the dark. Christmas Eve passed not with celebration, but with endurance. And though loneliness pressed hard, Margaret knew one truth she clung to as fiercely as the flame. She had not let the season die inside her. However small, however quiet, she had kept it alive. Christmas morning arrived soft and grey, the light muted by a sky heavy with clouds. Margaret woke earlier than she expected. Her body stirred less by excitement and more by habitudes of rising early to prepare stockings, to baste turkeys, to greet a child who once bounded down the stairs in pajamas. She lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creak of the house around her. When she finally rose, the air was cold enough to make her wrap her shawl tightly as she moved through the quiet rooms. The 2 stockings hung on the mantel, their fabric heavy with absence. She had tucked a few candies into them the night before, though no one but her would ever discover them. It felt foolish and tender all at once, an echo of a ritual she could not quite abandon. She brewed coffee and carried the mug to her chair. By the window, the candle she had left burning through the night had melted halfway down, its wax pooled in the base of the brass holder. She lit another and set it beside it, the twin flames casting a gentle glow against the frost-glazed glass. Her eyes kept flicking toward the phone on the side table. It sat there silent, black, a waiting sentinel. Margaret told herself not to expect anything, but still the hope lingered. A call, a Merry Christmas, Mom, a child's voice chiming in, Merry Christmas, Grandma. Something small, something to tether her to the day. She sipped her coffee and tried to distract herself with the radio. The steady stream of carols and cheerful announcers, describing parades and services across town. She opened her journal, intending to write, but the words stuck. Each time her eyes drifted back to the phone, her stomach tightened. 9 o'clock passed. 10. She tidied the kitchen, baked a small pan of scones she would eat alone. She set one on a plate with butter and jam, the ritual almost comical in its precision. Still no call. By noon, the silence had become a weight pressing down on her chest. She checked the phone 3 times, convinced she must have missed something, though the screen remained blank. She thought of Evan and Claire around their tree, their children tearing into gifts. Perhaps Evan had thought of her for a moment, perhaps even mentioned her name, but the phone had not rung. She sat again by the window, the scone untouched on the plate before her. She whispered aloud, surprising herself with the sound of her own voice. You could have called, just once, just a minute. The empty room gave no answer. Her hands trembled as she opened her journal at last. She wrote with sharp strokes, the words tumbling out faster than she could control them. December 25th. The call never came. I waited, foolishly, as though love could be proven by a ringtone. I told myself not to expect it, but still I waited. Each hour that passed carved deeper into me. Do they not understand what silence does? Do they not know that absence speaks louder than any word? Her breath caught, and she pressed the pen harder to the page. I have given them everything: strength, joy stitched into stockings and baked into pies. And today, they gave me nothing, not even a moment of their voices. I am not forgotten. I am dismissed. That is worse. She stopped then, pen hovering, tears falling onto the paper and smudging the ink. After a long while, she set it down and folded her hands together. The phone remained silent through the afternoon, through the evening. She ate her scone cold, drank tea lukewarm, and watched the candle burn low. As night fell, she whispered again, softer this time, not to the absent phone but to herself. The call never came, but I am still here. And though the words trembled in the air, they held her steady enough to light one more candle against the dark. The day after Christmas, the world outside Margaret's window looked hushed, as though the snow itself had decided to cover the remnants of yesterday's joy. Wrapping paper and ribbons might still linger in trash bins across town. Pine needles might scatter across other families' floors, but none of it reached her. Her house was still, her mantle unchanged, the stockings still drooping with untouched candies. She rose slowly, joints aching from a night of restless sleep. The silence seemed louder today, the kind that pressed into her ears until she almost longed for the sound of a slammed door or a clattering dish. Anything to remind her she wasn't the last voice left in her home. By noon, she found herself seated at the kitchen table with a sheet of stationery spread before her. She hadn't planned it. Her hands simply reached for paper and pen, the way her heart reached for air. She stared at the blank page, her mind heavy with words she had never spoken. Then, almost without thinking, she began to write. Dear Evan. Her hand trembled as she shaped the letters, but once they were there, the rest came more quickly. Christmas has always been my favorite season, not because of gifts or food, but because it gave me you. I remember your small hand tugging mine on frosty mornings, your eyes lighting up at stockings, your laughter filling our home. Those memories are stitched into me. They are my treasure. She paused, the ink pooling at the tip of her pen. A lump swelled in her throat, but she pressed on. Yesterday, I waited by the phone. I know you were busy. I know life has its demands, but I hoped for just a word, even for Lily or Jonah to say hello. The silence hurt more than I can explain. It told me I am not part of your Christmas anymore. And yet, I cannot stop being your mother. I cannot stop loving you. Her eyes blurred. She dabbed at them with her sleeve, smearing a faint streak across the page. I don't ask for grand gestures, Evan, only for a place however small in your life. To be remembered, to be included, even if only in a phone call. I am not asking to take Christmas away from anyone. I only want to share in it, because love, to me, has always been meant to be shared. Her hand slowed as fatigue set in. She signed her name carefully. Love, Mom. When she looked at the letter, it seemed to glow. Against the dim kitchen light, it was raw, imperfect, but true. Every word carried the weight of the ache that had built inside her since that diner booth. She folded it gently, slid it into an envelope, and wrote Evan's name on the front. Then she sat with it in her hand. For a long time, the seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into an hour. She imagined the post office, the letter slipping into his mailbox, his fingers tearing it open, his eyes scanning her plea. Would he read it with understanding, with guilt, with dismissal? Would Claire intercept it? Would it cause anger, or worse, indifference? By late afternoon, Margaret placed the envelope in the drawer of her sideboard, tucking it beneath napkins she seldom used. She pressed it down as though hiding a secret, her heart torn between relief and grief. She lit the candle in the window again, watching the flame flicker. Then she opened her journal and wrote, December 26th. Today I wrote Evan a letter. Every word was true, every word mine, and yet I could not send it. Perhaps courage failed me. Perhaps I am protecting myself from knowing his response. For now, it rests in silence, like me, but at least the words exist. At least I have spoken them to the page, if not to him. She closed the journal, her hand resting on its cover. The envelope stayed hidden, unsent, but alive. And in that, Margaret felt the faintest pulse of peace that her love had been put into words, even if they never found their way to his eyes. The days after Christmas passed slowly, the kind of winter days where light barely managed to seep through thick clouds, where the air outside seemed brittle enough to break. Margaret found herself moving between small rituals, lighting the candle in the window at dusk, making tea in the mornings, writing in her journal before bed. Each act was small, ordinary, yet together they carried her through the silence. On the morning of December 30th, she decided to take down the stockings. They had hung on the mantel for nearly a month now, to quiet witnesses to her grief. She lifted the first one gently, fingers brushing the fabric. Inside were the candies she had tucked in, still untouched, still wrapped, as if waiting. For a moment, she considered putting them back in the cupboard, saving them for another year. But something in her shifted. She unwrapped one and placed it on her tongue. The chocolate melted slowly, bittersweet, filling her mouth with a taste that belonged entirely to her. It struck her then. Not every tradition had to wither because she was alone. Some could be reclaimed, reimagined, even reborn. She didn't need permission to hold on to Christmas, or to love the rituals she had built across a lifetime. Later that afternoon, she pulled out her old photo albums. They smelled faintly of dust and lavender, their covers worn from years of use. She flipped through page after page of On, as a boy in footy pajamas, Michael holding him proudly in front of the tree, her mother stringing popcorn garlands across a fireplace. Each photograph held a piece of her, of them, of what had once made this house vibrate with life. Tears came, but they were different this time, less sharp, more like rain washing the dust from forgotten corners. She realized that legacy wasn't confined to one moment, one Christmas, or even one family gathering. Legacy was in the laughter frozen in photographs, in the recipes written in her mother's hand, in the candles she lit each night. Legacy lived because she carried it, whether or not anyone else chose to see it. That evening, She wrote in her journal with a steadier hand than she'd felt in weeks. December 30th, my son did not call. The silence remains, and perhaps it always will, but I am not erased. My love has roots deeper than rejection. My legacy does not vanish because it is ignored. It is here in the flame I light, in the chocolate I taste, in the songs I still hum when the house is quiet. I have given more of myself than anyone can take away, and that is enough to keep me lit, like the candle against the dark. She closed the journal and set it aside. Then she rose, went to the kitchen, and rummaged through cupboards. She pulled out flour, sugar, and spices, her hands moving with muscle memory. Before long, the smell of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the air, the scent of her mother's old recipe for spiced bread. She hadn't baked it in years, not since Michael passed, but as it baked, the house began to feel different, less empty, more alive, as if history itself had returned to sit at her table. When the bread cooled, she sliced it, wrapped half in foil, and set it by the door. Tomorrow, she would bring it to Thomas's hardware store. She would not announce it as a plea for company, but as a gift on offering of her own presence in the world. That night, Margaret placed the second loaf on her plate and ate it slowly, savoring each bite. The candle in the window burned beside her, steady as always. She did not know what the new year would bring. Perhaps the silence would continue. Perhaps the letter would remain unsent. Perhaps her place in Evan's life was gone for good. But she understood something now. Her story was not finished, not defined by who had stepped away. Her story was still burning quiet, persistent, and alive like the flame in the window, guiding not just others, but herself, home.